My name is Yellen, and I'm currently an intern at PSCORE. Welcome to PSCORE's workshop for Group 5. We have been preparing a workshop to discuss issues related to reunification of the Korean Peninsula with representatives from all around the world. Human rights as we know it in North Korea is very much so limited and oppressing to unspeakable degrees. Within the citizens themselves, they have no right to free speech, and even accessibility to information and news is thoroughly regulated through filtered governmental reports. In just 2017, North Korea was reported to have approximately 200,000 prisoners who were incarcerated in camps dedicated to just political crimes and thus subjected to political abuse, labor, and even to public execution. For example, the economical status, cultural aspects, and even educational backgrounds were all topics that go so much more in depth that we could strip to the core of human rights in North Korea. We thought that by opening up the floor and talking about this, it would greatly contribute to the criticism of the harsh reality right now. So the topic we sought out to explore is, what are the different dimensions and aspects we have to think about when we consider North Korean human rights?
Hello, my name is Adolat and I'm from Uzbekistan. I'm doing my master's degree at Ewha Women's University and majoring at international relations. That's why I'm so excited to participate in this workshop because this workshop is straightly related to world politics and human rights issues.
Hi, I'm Audrey Gregg. I'm 23 years old and I live and work in South Korea.
My name is Jessica McClary and I go to Yonsei University and I study comparative literature and culture, and I do a lot of North Korean related things, and I study North Korean culture, less the politics and more like human rights and culture. So I'm very excited to be here today.
So I'm Gabriella Scherenberg. I'm 20 years old from the US and I'm currently studying international studies at Korea University.
저는 현재 24살이고 부산에서 대학교 다니고 있는 정범이라고 합니다.
네, 안녕하세요. 저는 28살 하고 현재 대학교 경영대학교를 다니고 있고요. 또 이런 워크숍에 참여할 기회를 주셔서 매우 감사드리고 있습니다.
So even though there are several historical examples of successful reunification like East and West Germany and South and North Vietnam, here in Korean Peninsula it has its own challenges like economic, political, like geopolitical and social barriers. First of all, the main barrier, in my opinion, it's a political barrier. Even the division of Korea happened because of the clash of interests of superpowers many years ago, and even now because of this clash of interests, there is a difficulty of reunification. For example, South Korea and Japan is the big ally of the US, while North Korea is backed by China and partly by Russia as well. Because of North Korean threat, the US is keeping its troops in South Korea and Japan. And the second issue, economic burden, because North Korea is like agricultural country and GDP is so low, while South Korea is like one of the biggest economies of the world. In the case of reunification, monetary issues is likely to happen. So as I know, in 2009, in North Korea, there happened currency revaluation. It caused many economic crisis, and it weakened North Korean won. If after reunification, forces of globalization would likely crush North Korean businesses. Also, nationalism is one of the barriers for reunification, because younger Koreans, they are not interested, there is no memory of unified Korea. Before Korean War, youngsters in Korea less interested in Korean reunification. So as we can see, there are lots of barriers for reunification.
I think inevitably the first step is going to be primarily economic and maybe political. To be honest, I think that it'll probably be because of some diplomatic pressure that the US or China puts on North Korea that will lead to reunification. And ultimately, I think this is a shame because it should be up to the needs of the people in like the two respective countries. But at least historically, all the diplomatic relations between like North Korea, South Korea, China, and the US have all been kind of economically driven.
Throughout modern history, there hasn't been many cases of reunification between divided countries for so long. So I think there are three main factors that everyone thinks about, which is the political issue, the economic issues, and then the social issues. So I think the largest initial barrier will be the political issue, obviously, because there are lots of different countries and regimes involved. And then the economic burden will be very difficult for a while. Finally, the social burden won't be noticed as much at first, but then slowly throughout the years, that'll become a large problem. So there's a lot of different things we have to consider, but obviously, yeah, the first and most pressing issue is political barrier. We don't even know if it can happen.
So for me, in researching all this and hearing everyone else's opinions in all the meetings that we had, I definitely think the first step for reunification is going to have to be something economic, as my peers have previously said. I think something like complete social, political integration is very, very difficult to achieve with just the extremely long separation history that North and South Korea have, and as well as just trying to mix the two countries together in a socio-political way is not exactly beneficial to both of them, especially if it was something to happen quickly. So an economic change would be the first thing that would have to occur.
제가 개인적으로 느꼈을 때 통일은 우선 언어적인 통합이 먼저 돼야 된다고 생각을 해요. 왜냐면 북한과 지금 남한의 언어가 상당히 많이 다르기 때문에 이거를 서로 교육을 통해서 언어를 먼저 통합하는 것이 중요하다고 생각을 합니다.
솔직히 제가 생각하기에는 통일은 아주 먼 얘기여서 굳이 이런 얘기를 하는 게 맞나 싶긴 한데, 통일은 단계가 아니라 통일은 결과가 아니라 수단으로 쓰여져야 된다고 생각하고, 서로 간에 먼저 의사소통이 원활하게 돼야지 통일을 얘기할 수 있다고 생각을 합니다.
Well, when we talked about this last week, Jess actually brought up the interesting point that reunification could take a bunch of different forms. I think reunification in the classical sense of just the border's gone and it's just one Korea is really, really unlikely. I think probably sort of like an economic free trade zone is the most likely form of reunification that we're looking at.
In my opinion, especially learning new information, I don't think it's something that is completely unrealistic, but I do think reunification has to be defined as something that's going to be a process. It's going to take a long time to happen, and it definitely should, because obviously integrating these completely two different places and just have all the aspects about them is going to take a lot of work and a lot of negotiation, changes in every manner.
미팅을 통해서 다른 팀원들의 의견을 들었을 때처럼 통일은 직접적으로 국경을 바로 개방하는 것이 아닌 점진적인 통일을 이뤄야 된다고 생각을 하는데요. 점진적인 통일을 통해서 화폐를 통합을 하고 언어를 교육을 하고 또 무역을 함으로써 그렇게 점진적으로 진행하다 보면은 좀 더 현실성 있는 통일이 되지 않을까 생각합니다.
While I was researching North Korean human rights, I found very interest in the constitution of North Korea. Most of the basic human rights, they are provided by constitution of North Korea, like right of expression, religion, but in reality it's not like that. The points I found interesting while I was researching North Korean human rights were restrictions on freedom of expression, religion and movement within the country.
I think free speech anyone would probably say free speech, but I kind of also focused on social mobility in my research. Kim Il-sung had this idea of, like the loyal, wavering, and hostile class, and kind of like flipped the class structure as it was in the 1950s. So people like Christians and missionaries and landlords and merchants are all considered hostile, and that also determines how much food they get during times of famine, kind of their economic opportunities. And I think that lack of social mobility, the inability to kind of advance to like higher sangbun, is like probably one of the worst human rights issues in North Korea.
I think the largest issue which the human rights stem from is obviously the need for social control, which helps ensure the survival of the Kim regime and the entire country as itself. So all of the human rights issues basically stem from this. So one way to potentially take care of them is obviously for the system to change, although that's quite difficult, as we all know. So yeah, but I think the main factor, I guess, probably the worst human rights issue is political prison camps. At least it's the one the media tends to focus the most on.
The main problem with North Korean human rights right now, I think, goes along with the classism that exists in the country right now, and it's freedom of speech, and also the sort of like indoctrination, the brainwashing that happens is the biggest problem, because it's the higher status people trying to keep the lower class ignorant, just making sure that they're doing exactly what they want, and only the people who are at the top continue to benefit, only the people who are at the top continue to succeed and have a better quality of life. And also as well, from what I read in the packets from PSCORE and learned more about this time, was the abuse of children and women in North Korea is definitely another aspect that needs to be addressed.
제가 생각했을 때 가장 큰 문제는 여성 인권이라고 생각을 해요. 현재 북한 내에서도 1990년도 이후로 장마당이라는 게 생겼는데, 그 장마당 안에서도 여성들이 장사를 하면서 숙식할 곳이 없어서 성매매라든가 강간을 당한다는 그런 다큐멘터리를 본 적이 있어서, 그 이후에는 북한 인권을 생각할 때는 여성 인권이 주로 떠오르는 것 같습니다.
뭐 여성 인권 문제도 있고 뭐 여러 가지 문제가 있는데, 제가 생각하기에는 아무래도 학생들이 공부를 해야 되는데 너무 농장 같은 데 끌려가서 그냥 육체적으로 노동도 해가지고 나중에 학교 공부를 제대로 못하고 노동만 하는 그런 게 너무 문제여서, 아무래도 육아 노동, 또 청년 노동, 이런 문제가 저는 가장 심각하다고 생각합니다.
Realistically, reunification seems like quite difficult for me because of different barriers, like as I mentioned before, like economic, political, and social. That's why, in my opinion, North Korea should ease up and like open up within itself first for development, and then like reunification may happen like efficiently.
I think the US needs to extend like an earnest olive branch to North Korea. I think historically, like Obama did nothing in 8 years and just was kind of waiting for the regime to crumble, and then Trump, just to like bolster his chances of re-election, was kind of having these fake talks that were sort of unproductive. North Korea can barter with its nuclear arsenal, and we can say, oh, we want you to reduce sanctions, and kind of with those bargaining points, we could make some kind of deal about human rights.
I think right now, in the current situation that we have, it's difficult to solve these human rights violations. If we can try and work on the root factors that cause some of the issues, so like, for example, we mentioned before in our discussions about child labor on farms and etc. And perhaps the reason why we need this kind of labor is because there's a food shortage. If we can get like international help, like more developed farming techniques, or like help solving the food shortage, we could also aim to tackle the human rights issues of labor on farms and etc. So I think we should try and look at the root causes of some of the issues to solve them.
The best way to solve this issue is going to be with an intervention from the United States or another country, honestly, because I think that sometimes in negotiations between countries, when it's only just the two and there's no sort of outer opinion, outer view, it can be really difficult for each side to kind of be neutral and kind of try and come to something that helps with both of them. So if you have this outside mediating source, it kind of makes it better. So we see, okay, this side would benefit from having this side would benefit from these changes, and then you have a good middle ground to meet upon.
사실 현실적으로 한 나라의 여성 인권을 고치기란 너무 어려운 문제인 것 같아요. 현재 지금 남한도 많은 여성 인권이 낮은 상태이기 때문에 우리가 남한의 여성 인권을 올리는 방법들이나 경험들을 통해서 추후에 북한 여성들이 국경을 넘거나 중국의 국경을 넘거나 했을 때 그분들한테 안내 책자를 드린다거나 하는 것이 좋지 않을까라고 생각하면서도 사실 그건 현실적으로 좀 불가능할 것 같기도 하고 그렇습니다.
솔직히 현실적으로 저는 해결책은 없는 것 같고요. 해결책보다는 서로의 이 문제에 대해서 예를 들어서 우리나라 사람들, 남한 사람들 뿐만 아니라 북한 사람들, 남한 사람들, 그리고 다른 외국에 있는 사람들, 뭐 미국 사람들, 독일 사람들, 그 사람들한테 더욱더 이런 문제들을 널리 알려서 아, 북한에 정말 이런 문제가 있구나. 아, 정말 이렇게 사람들이 힘들게 공부를 하고 힘들게 살고 있구나. 뭐 이런 문제를 좀 더 한번 그들에게 상기시켰으면 저는 좋다고 생각합니다.
It depends and differs case by case. For example, disparity issue may remain in a certain time because it's not easy to get better lifestyle immediately, and there may happen the huge influx of movement of North Koreans to South Korea. For example, for child labor or child abuse, this kind of issues can be solved immediately after the reunification.
I think that really depends on the type of reunification. I think free speech issues would necessarily have to get better. In the event of reunification with South Korea, I mean, just for economic free trade and all of that good stuff, I think free speech would have to be a thing. Maybe I worded that badly, but I think free speech would, it would be better.
Human rights violations is both systematic and cultural. So I think even if we can get rid of the systematic human rights abuses, it'll take a while for it to go away culturally. So for example, I'll give the farming example again. Even if there's not a need for child laborers on farms anymore, after reunification, your grandparents might say, oh, you need to still work on the farm. I worked on the farm when I was little, so why can't you do it too? It's just a cultural thing. It's part of the family business. I think there are some more cultural human rights factors that are going to take a lot more time and slowly go away. And then there are some that are going to be more immediate, like we can free the prisoners from labor camps, etc. But I think there's different categories of the human rights violations.
I think that with the reunification course that I think would happen being more economic based, the human rights issues would probably continue for a while after the reunification process begins, simply because you can't focus on that when you're focusing on economic problems. But I think that as it progresses, as the country would start to open up more, if you had free trade, that eventually the socio-political openness would come along with that. So once the social-political openness begins again, I think once that happens, then the countries and the politicians and such would be able to start negotiating and working on bettering the system and creating better human rights.
네, 저는 사실 어느 나라든 인권 문제는 늘 대두된다고 생각을 해요. 우리가 흔히 생각하는 선진국 내에서도 인종차별이 문제가 일어나고 현재 미국 내에서도 많은 인종차별이 일어나고 있는 것만큼 인권에 대한 문제는 완벽하게 100% 해결되지 않는다고 생각합니다. 특히나 북한의 경우 남아선언서상 가부장제가 가장 심한 나라이기 때문에 통일 이후에도 북한 내부에 있던 인권 문제들이 한국과 맞물리면서 새로운 인권 문제가 생겨날 거라고 생각을 해요.
So I'm going to say something controversial maybe, but I don't think there's any country in the world or any government in the world where there's like an earnest desire to help citizens. Like I think it's all kind of geopolitical, and every regime or government wants stability. And I think just that looks different depending on the country. I wouldn't necessarily say that that's a unique characteristic of North Korea. Historical reasons, having a dictatorship that limits free speech is the best path to stability for the Kims.
Much like another peer of mine, Audrey, said in this, I do believe that in all countries, the government somewhat focuses more on their own benefit rather than the benefit of all their citizens. But I think that the reason why this is so pervasive and more, obviously much more of an issue in North Korea is, once again, as I mentioned, because of the classism is extremely heightened compared to other countries. Obviously, some places have the gap between the rich and the poor, and people with power and people who are just, more common, ordinary. But in North Korea, the fact that this is so put into indoctrination and so just pervasive, I think this is what makes it why they focus on themselves. The government just wants to keep themselves in power, obviously with the generations of the family, and now we're at Kim Jong-un. They just want to keep everything to their own benefit and they don't think about the common people.
제가 느꼈을 때는 정치권 세력들의 이기심인 것 같아요. 어쨌든 국가가 해야 될 일들을 지키지 않고 그들의 이익을 위해서 행동하기 때문에 그렇게 그 국가가 본래의 기능을 상실하게 된 거라고 생각합니다.